Next, a hearing on the Environmental Protection Agency and recent recommendations made to the EPA on ways to improve its efficiencies and operations. Held by a House Oversight Subcommittee, this is an hour and a half.
All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our hearing, the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce. The subcommittee convenes this hearing today to examine unimplemented recommendations by the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Inspector General and Government Accountability Office. Acting on these recommendations would improve EPA's ability to carry out its core mission, protecting human health and the environment. This mission is never more important than during times of natural disaster, like the one on the Gulf Coast are experiencing right now in Hurricane Harvey, and what we're about to hit with another hurricane on the Florida coast. First of all, on behalf of the committee, I want to express my sincere sorrow to everyone impacted by this storm. Hurricane Harvey is one of the worst natural disasters the United States has ever faced, and it's still too early to tell the full extent of the devastation that has displaced thousands of people. Members of this committee on both sides of the aisle represent constituents experiencing loss and destruction from the storm, and our thoughts and prayers are with these families as they begin to rebuild their lives from this national tragedy. During the storm and in the aftermath, EPA continues to play a critical role in the federal response to Hurricane Harvey. While EPA is still in the midst of initial response efforts, its work has only just begun. We look forward to monitoring the agency's response to the disaster and learn the full extent of the environmental impact and challenges that lie ahead. The loss and destruction of Hurricane Harvey make today's hearing even more important. Excuse me. The committee has the opportunity to learn about ways to strengthen the EPA, including highlighting unimplemented recommendations that may improve EPA's ability to protect the environment and human health during recovery efforts or future natural disasters. And I go back and reflect on what we're about to face in Florida and Puerto Rico and the disasters that are looming there. Now, the Constitution provides Congress with the authority to conduct oversight of the executive branch, and in partnership with the Government Accountability Office and Office of Inspector General, we work together to root out waste, fraud, and abuse at federal agencies such as the EPA. Through investigations and audits, both GAO and OIG often make recommendations on ways to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of EPA. And after these recommendations are issued, GAO and OIG work with the agency to ensure that the EPA acts on their findings. Today, the committee will learn that even when EPA agrees with recommendations, it may take years to implement them, and some are never fully adopted by the agency. As a result, many of the open recommendations span multiple administrations, some dating as far back as the Bush administration. While EPA adopts recommendations at a rate around the federal government average, there are still unimplemented recommendations in many critical areas of the agency. According to the OIG's most recent semi-annual report to Congress, released in May 2017, EPA has the potential to save $103.3 million by implementing OIG's open recommendations. The semi-annual report showed 43 open recommendations with past due completion dates and 56 with due dates set in the future. The GAO will testify that EPA has implemented 191 of the 318 recommendations made since 2007, with 127 recommendations still unimplemented. OIG and GAO have both highlighted deficiencies in EPA's management and operations, including concerns about EPA's information security posture, workforce management, and grant administration. For example, EPA OIG recently conducted an audit focusing on flaws relating to EPA's information security posture during fiscal years 2015 and 2016. The OIG reported that the agency lacks an understanding of which contractors at the EPA have significant information security responsibilities, raising questions about the agency's network integrity. The OIG recommended the EPA develop a process for identifying these contractors. The EPA is not expected to implement this recommendation until December 31st of 2018. GAO and OIG have also uncovered waste and mismanagement in EPA's grant programs. This is particularly troubling because grants comprise almost half of the EPA's budget, about $4 billion annually. In 2016, GAO found that EPA's grant monitoring practices may impact the agency's ability to efficiently monitor results and increase administrative costs. Additionally, in 2017, GAO reported that the EPA did not have the information it needed to allocate grant management resources effectively. GAO recommendations range from standardizing the format of grant recipient progress reports to developing a process to analyze workloads. All 12 recommendations in these 2 reports remain unimplemented. These are just some of the many reports and audits conducted by the OIG and GAO. We will discuss more of them today. Both the EPA, OIG, and GAO have done excellent work to highlight the problems within EPA and find solutions to solve these issues. So I'm grateful for your work and look forward to hearing more about your findings. I want to add here, with things looming in Florida and with the tragedies in Texas, I can probably speak for the committee. We better not find out the EPA has dawdled on anything that's caused any harm. We know there's a great deal of water pollution that's out there because of the overwhelming of sewer systems. We're concerned about the increase in Zika mosquitoes in Texas. We don't know if some of that has to do with some issues with water management and other things within the jurisdiction of EPA. We will keep a close watch on all those and see if there's any errors that have occurred related to weaknesses in the agencies implementing things that has caused some of these problems. So I thank our witnesses today for your dedication and work to ensure that EPA is carrying out its mission. I want to especially recognize Alfredo Gómez, our witness from GAO. He's a Houston native who has 2 nephews serving in the fire department there. They doing okay? Mr. Gómez, yes, there. We appreciate their service and sacrifice during Hurricane Harvey and its aftermath. With this now, I turn to my colleague from Florida to recognize her an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for their work. The hearing subject, while important, pales in comparison of the true oversight needed of the Trump Environmental Protection Agency. EPA is and always has been a critical partner to our states and communities back home. Most of what EPA does is to support our communities back home in cleaning up polluted sites, helping protect the air we breathe and the water we drink. And I thank the professionals and scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency for their work. But President Trump and Administrator Scott Pruitt have a very different vision, unfortunately, and they have been acting to weaken support for our communities back home that comes through the EPA. And it is particularly troubling that EPA Administrator Pruitt has not appeared before the Energy and Commerce Committee to date. This committee has direct oversight of the EPA, and it's simply unprecedented and unacceptable that the administrator has not appeared before the committee. Now, the importance of the EPA is particularly clear as Texas learns more about the scope and extent of the destruction caused by Hurricane Harvey. There's nothing like a disaster response that demonstrates how critical toxic chemical, Superfund, and other EPA local initiatives are to the health and safety of our neighbors. As a Floridian, I know all too well the devastation that massive hurricanes can bring to homes, businesses, and communities. And the recovery from such a storm is long, expensive, and challenging. And our thoughts are with the residents of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Floridians as they're in the path of another extremely dangerous storm in Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Harvey slammed into the Gulf Coast as a Category 4. So far, it has left at least 60 people dead and billions of dollars in damage, and the death toll and estimated cost recovery is likely to continue to rise in the coming weeks. Ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health, Representative Gene Green, I just saw him at the other subcommittee meeting, represents the city of Houston and has seen much of his district flooded, and our thoughts are with him and his constituents at this time. And Mr. Gómez, I want to recognize you for being here today. It's what is surely a difficult time for you and your family. The EPA has been a key agency responding to Harvey, and for this reason, this hearing should be a timely and important step in exploring how to strengthen the agency as it supports local responders and begins to assess the possible environmental impact of the flooding, toxic releases. But this hearing, unfortunately, is devoted to a much less significant topic. The scope of potential environmental risks caused by this ongoing crisis, while still coming into focus, are considerable. People are evacuating through dirty and contaminated floodwaters that may contain bacteria or toxic substances. There have also been reports of fires at chemical facilities, which may involve the release of toxic pollutants. Additional reports have also suggested possible damage to leaking gas tanks at fuel facilities, which, if true, may pose environmental concerns that the EPA will need to address. And I'm particularly concerned about reports of flooding Superfund sites and what damage they may have caused. For example, according to EPA, 13 of the 41 former and current toxic waste sites in Harvey-impacted areas have flooded and may have experienced some damage. Additionally, the city of Houston contains approximately 450 petrochemical plants. News reports indicate these plants have contributed to 74 incidents of excess air pollution since Harvey hit, emitting more than 1 million pounds of hazardous substances into the air. See, our local communities need the expertise of the EPA to prevent and mitigate such releases. But the Trump administration has been working overtime to weaken EPA's ability to help back home. And now it's really showing at a time of disaster. The storm also raises ongoing concerns of drinking water safety. According to EPA, 4,500 drinking water systems are potentially threatened by floodwaters, disrupted sewage systems. Now, after Hurricane Katrina, Energy and Commerce professional staff were on the ground to help. And this committee should consider oversight hearings in Texas in the near term. But today's hearing, rather than focusing on the big picture, examines implemented recommendations for EPA. At a time when the real issue is the decimation of the EPA professional workforce proposed by President Trump and Administrator Pruitt. And yet we respond to the grave environmental and human health risks of Hurricane Harvey and other catastrophes at this time, but the overall EPA has never been more important. Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply troubled by the direction of the agency under the Trump administration, and I implore you and my Republican colleagues to conduct true oversight of the damage being done to our bedrock environmental protections built through decades of bipartisan work. And we need to do it before deep and lasting damage is inflicted across America. The Trump EPA is waging an aggressive rollback of environmental and human health protections through politicization of the agency, extreme proposed budget and staffing cuts, repealing or delaying rulemaking, and attacking fundamental science. The Trump administration proposed extreme budget cuts that cut to the heart of our local communities and threaten the health and environment of Americans in every state. The Trump budget would slash EPA's budget by nearly $2.6 billion, reduce the professional workforce there by over 3,000 employees, and the damage will be done to our air quality, diesel emission reductions, lead safety, and it goes on and on. Already there is evidence of conflicts of interest, favoritism towards certain businesses, and grants changed to exact political revenge. This is not acceptable, and this is what needs oversight. The ongoing crisis unfolding on the Gulf Coast demonstrates the dangers of the Trump administration's extreme assault on environmental protection. Mr. Chairman, we want to work with you to make sure the EPA implements the workforce and contractor recommendations. But if we're serious about ensuring that the agency is able to protect human health and the environment, then we must work together to conduct true oversight of the fundamental damage being done to this agency and our neighbors back home. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the Full Committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. And I would, just in response to my friend from Florida, our committee staff, the Oversight Committee, has worked diligently throughout the last several weeks in clear communication with the various agencies involved in the hurricane. This hearing was put together before Harvey had a name. So we will do our oversight and continue to. At the appropriate time, I anticipate there will be a delegation that will go and hold hearings or do appropriate review. I'm one, when there's an emergency going on, tries to stay out of the way of the first responders and let them do their job. And so at the right time, we'll do that. And we will have our Administrator Pruitt before our committee sooner rather than later. I share a frustration that there's been a long delay in getting some of these positions filled, partly by our friends in the Senate, but the time has come for these agency heads to come for our committee, and they will. Now, as to this hearing, I appreciate Subcommittee Chairman Murphy having this in his opening comments. We care deeply about what's happened in Texas. We care deeply about what's about to happen in Florida. My own district is on fire, and much destruction going on there. All of these things matter. You want to talk about air quality, You know, we could use your support on some of our forestry legislation to reduce the fuel loads so we don't poison people with fires and destroy watersheds. Now, we know that these recovery efforts will continue for years. Recovering from any disaster, whether it's Hurricane Harvey or Irma or the destructive wildfires burning out of control throughout the West, requires coordination at every level of the government, and the EPA is a critical part of that. The challenges facing the EPA that pertain to Harvey are significant, but I hope the agency seizes upon the lessons it learned in responses to previous natural disasters, such as Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. Today's hearing represents the first opportunity to hear from the EPA Office of Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office regarding any outstanding recommendations that, if implemented, could enable the agency to better achieve or do its job better. We'll also examine some of the areas of concern that have been identified and commented upon by the OIG and the GAO, but whose recommendations remain unimplemented by the EPA. We should be mindful, however, that many of the OIG and GAO's unimplemented recommendations span multiple administrations and therefore represent long-standing challenges for the agency. For example, we've learned the EPA has failed to complete an agency-wide workload analysis in more than 20 years. Similarly, both OIG and GAO have consistently identified issues that generate serious concerns as to whether EPA has knowledge of or adequately monitors the activities of its contractors and grant recipients, despite the significant portion of the agency's annual budget that's awarded to third parties. Addressing these issues will increase transparency and accountability to EPA, in addition to enabling the agency to make better-informed budgetary decisions. I believe that all Americans want a healthy environment for themselves, their families, and their communities, and I'd like to thank Alan Larsen from the EPA OIG and Alfredo Gómez from the GAO for joining us today to provide testimony and to expand upon their organization's findings and recommendations. I'd also like to recognize and thank Mr. Gómez's nephews, who I understand are serving the Houston Fire Department. Thank you for their work as first responders who bravely have assisted so many of their fellow citizens during Hurricane Harvey. I'm looking forward to productive discussion this morning regarding actions EPA can take which will enable the agency to better accomplish its core mission of protecting human health and the environment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Appreciate the gentleman for yielding back, and I recognize Ranking Member Mr. Pallone for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a week and a half since Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, and as the scope of the environmental disaster only begins to become known, thousands remain displaced, their homes and businesses flooded. And I know firsthand the immense devastation caused by such natural disasters. In 2012, my district was hit hard by Hurricane Sandy. I'd never seen worse storm damage in our area in my lifetime. For many, this storm was a worst-case scenario: lives lost, homes flooded, businesses lost. Our nation is now experiencing historic levels of destruction and loss on the Gulf Coast in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. Our fellow members of Congress, including 5 members of the Texas delegation on this committee, are working hard with federal, state, and local officials and first responders to help those affected by the storm. And as the cleanup continues, many grave environmental and human health risks exist. In the days since Hurricane Harvey came ashore, we've seen chemical plants on fire, fuel tanks leaking, mass releases of toxic pollutants into the air, and flooded federal Superfund sites. I'm deeply concerned of the potential risk to human health and the environment caused by exposure to the hazardous materials kept at these sites. And this committee must work to understand the impact some of these facilities may have on public health. The Trump administration recently delayed amendments to the risk management program, which included safety requirements for companies to store large quantities of dangerous chemicals. Moreover, the environmental issues resulting from the hurricane also underscore the need for robust implementation of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. Communities have the right to know important details about the type and amount of harmful chemicals released in their neighborhoods. All of these risks underscore the need for a strong and capable EPA. Today, we're discussing recommendations by the EPA Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office regarding the EPA, and I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony and work on these recommendations. However, I would argue that recommendations for improving EPA's performance are part of a much wider need to ensure that the agency is high-performing, efficient, and effective in accomplishing the agency's mission of protecting human health and the environment. Over the last 6 months, EPA has been doing everything possible to operate in secrecy. Administrator Pruitt has no interest in transparency, and that should be unacceptable to every member of this committee. Administrator Pruitt repeatedly disregards oversight inquiries from the Democrats on this committee, and that should be unacceptable to anyone who believes we have an oversight responsibility. And the Trump EPA has proposed aggressive cuts to environment and human health protections, dismissed scientists from important advisory boards, and proposed severe budget and staffing reductions at EPA. These actions taken in totality serve to directly undermine the agency's ability to effectively protect human health and the environment. A robust and effective EPA is key in responding to natural disasters like Hurricane Harvey. And EPA currently has 143 personnel supporting the response efforts for Hurricane Harvey and has established a unified command with state and local partners. But that number is going to increase dramatically in the coming weeks. At its peak after Hurricane Katrina, about 1,600 EPA staff and contractors worked in the Gulf Coast region, assisting with response and cleanup activities, in addition to thousands of additional EPA employees supporting response efforts from EPA headquarters and regional offices around the country. With the employee cuts and buyouts that the administration has proposed, we need to ensure that EPA will actually have the employees in place to conduct this critical work. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to work with you to make sure we have a robust and effective EPA. The committee must conduct active oversight of the agency, particularly drinking water, infrastructure and regulation, clean air protections, and the impacts of climate change. We must also conduct ongoing oversight over EPA and other agencies' efforts to assist the Gulf Coast rebuild. And the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to weaken environmental health protections, attack fundamental science, and also to propose extreme budget and staff reductions will do nothing, in my opinion, but undermine EPA's efforts to protect human health and the environment, not only with regard to Hurricane Harvey, but in so many other areas. So I am concerned, and I hope that we can work together. And again, thanks to everyone, and I yield back, looking forward to your comments to the panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his comments. I ask unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be introduced in the record, and without objection, the documents will be entered into the record. I'd now like to introduce our panel of federal witnesses for today's hearing. First, we have Mr. Alan Larsen. He is the counsel to the Inspector General for the Environmental Protection Agency. We also have Mr. Alfredo Gómez, who serves as the Director of Natural Resources and Environment for the Government Accountability Office. I thank you for being here today and providing testimony. We look forward to the opportunity to discuss open and unimplemented recommendations made to the EPA. You're aware the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so has the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objections to taking testimony under oath? Seeing none, then, the chair advises you that under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you're entitled to be advised by counsel. Do either of you desire to be advised by counsel during testimony today? Neither one has asked for that, so in that case, would you please rise, raise your right hand, and I'll swear you in. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Both have answered the affirmative, and you are now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. I'll ask you each to give a 5-minute summary of your written statement. We'll begin with you, Mr. Larsen.
Good morning, Chairman Murphy.
Use your microphone.
Could you turn your microphone on, please? Thank you. And pull it close to you.
Am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Well, good morning again, Chairman Murphy, Representative Castor, and members of the subcommittee. I am Alan Larsen, counsel to the Inspector General for both the Environmental Protection Agency and the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. I thank this committee for highlighting the importance of acting on unimplemented OIG recommendations. As you know, an Office of Inspector General cannot direct an agency's actions. Our influence is through our recommendations, which can result in substantial cost savings and major improvements in agency programs, but only if an agency chooses to implement them. Our OIG undertakes a risk-based work planning process to determine which issues we will review during the coming year. Our plan, however, is always subject to change as we inevitably receive hotline requests and congressional requests. We conduct those reviews and issue final reports, which generally will include one or more recommendations to address our findings. As required by the Inspector General Act, the EPA OIG publishes a cumulative list of unimplemented recommendations in our semi-annual reports to Congress. Our most recent report cited 43 open recommendations with past due completion dates and 56 with future dates. Notably, potential cost savings for the unimplemented recommendations listed amount to over $100 million. Now, I will briefly discuss some of the OIG's recommendations to the EPA that remain unimplemented. You will see that some are quite recent. I highlight them because of their potential impact. In July 2017, we completed a review of the processes the EPA uses to verify that agency contractors have the training needed to protect the agency from cyber attacks. We found that the EPA is unaware of the number of contractors who require specialized training. The OIG recommended that the EPA implement a process to maintain a listing of contractors who require the specialized training, and that the agency report this information to its Chief Information Security Officer. While the agency has committed to implement a process for verifying that agency contractors are appropriately trained, our recommendation remains unimplemented, posing a continuing risk to the agency's information, data, and network. Through another audit completed in August of 2014, we looked at the agency's oversight of cloud computing initiatives. We found that the EPA's lack of oversight over vendors resulted in missed opportunities for significant savings. The EPA paid over $2 million for services that were not fully rendered or did not comply with federal requirements. We recommended several corrective actions to the agency, such as improving its policies and performing documented cost-benefit analyses. To date, the agency has not fully implemented all of our recommendations. In April 2017, we completed a review of Puerto Rico's state revolving funds based on a hotline complaint from the EPA. The EPA reported that the Puerto Rico Government Development Bank did not have funds to honor a combined balance of approximately $188 million. The OIG determined that over $774 million is at risk due to Puerto Rico's financial crisis, and that the restoration of funds in the near future is highly unlikely. The OIG recommended that the EPA evaluate options to restore the valuability of the revolving funds or implement new strategies better suited to the needs of Puerto Rico. While the agency has committed to considering future approaches to grant funding, the OIG's recommendation is as yet unimplemented. These are just a few of the examples of OIG's recommendations to the agency. We will continue to work actively with the EPA and keep Congress fully advised regarding actions to address our recommendations. Accomplishing our work requires sufficient appropriated funds from Congress. Our funding clearly represents a fruitful investment for the American taxpayer, as the OIG returned $22 for every dollar given to us in fiscal year 2016. While I'm aware that this is not an appropriations committee, I respectfully ask for any help you can provide us in this regard. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larsen. Mr. Gómez, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Chairman Murphy, Congresswoman Castor, members of the subcommittee, good morning, and I'm pleased to be here today to talk to you about the status of recommendations GAO has made to the Environmental Protection Agency. As you know, the mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment. We have conducted reviews focused on various aspects of EPA's operations, such as managing grants, workforce planning, and its programs. And through these reviews, we have made numerous recommendations to improve EPA's performance and the efficiency and effectiveness of its operations and programs. My statement today will focus on two main areas. First, the status of EPA's implementation of GAO's recommendations since fiscal year 2007, and how these recommendations relate to EPA's operations and programs. And two, examples of benefits realized by EPA and others based on our work. As part of our process, we follow up on recommendations we have made and report on their status to Congress. Agencies also have a responsibility to monitor and maintain accurate records on the status of our recommendations. We now follow up with EPA twice a year to determine the extent to which our recommendations have been implemented and the benefits that have been realized. We consider a recommendation implemented when the agency has taken actions to address the issue or deficiency that we have identified. With regard to the first area on the status of GAO's recommendations, we found that of the 318 recommendations we made to EPA, they had implemented 191. The remaining 127 recommendations remain open or not implemented. And just to give you some more information, for recommendations that we made over 4 years ago, that is recommendations from fiscal year 2007 to 2012, EPA has implemented 77%. For recommendations we made within the last 4 years, that is since fiscal year 2013, EPA has implemented 34%. Experience has shown that it takes time for some recommendations to be implemented. For this reason, we actively track each unaddressed or open recommendation for 4 years. The 318 recommendations we've made fall into 6 broad categories, such as management and operations, water-related issues, and environmental contamination and cleanup. For example, in January 2017, we reported on EPA's management of grants to states, local governments, and others, which make up almost 50% of the agency's budget. We found that EPA does not have sufficient information about the workload associated with these grants. Consequently, the agency is not able to effectively and efficiently allocate staff across its offices and regions to manage these grants. Because the agency did not know its grants' workload, it sometimes has to shift staff from other mission areas to address the work. We recommended that EPA collect and analyze data about grants management workloads and use these data to inform staff allocations. EPA agreed with this recommendation and has initiated steps to address it, and we will continue to monitor EPA's actions to make sure to figure out what the status of the recs are. We have also identified many benefits, such as programmatic and process improvements, based on EPA taking actions on our recommendations. For example, we issued several reports on drinking water and wastewater infrastructure issues. In particular, we reported on drinking water and wastewater infrastructure needs of rural and small communities. We found that some communities face potentially duplicative application requirements, such as separate environmental analyses for each program that they applied for, resulting in delays and increased costs to communities. We recommended that EPA and the Department of Agriculture work together with state and other officials to develop guidelines to assist states in developing uniform environmental analyses, and they have done so. In summary, our recommendations provide a good opportunity to improve the government's fiscal position, better serve the public, and make government programs more effective and efficient. EPA's implementation of our recommendations will help the agency continue to improve its performance and the efficiency and effectiveness of its operations. And we will continue to work with Congress to monitor and draw attention to these important issues. Chairman Murphy, Congresswoman Castor, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I also just wanted to add thank you for your words of support to my family in Texas and my nephews, but also all the other families in Texas. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larsen. Mr. Gómez, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes here of questions. First of all, your organizations have consistently highlighted EPA's failures to perform adequate workforce and workload analysis as being an area of concern, warranting some corrective action by the agency, which has not occurred. So, Mr. Gómez, start with you. Could you explain how EPA's failure to assess its workforce and workload, grants, whatever, hinders its ability to respond to natural disasters like Hurricane Harvey and Irma?
So what we've talked about in our work looking at workforce planning and grants management is that it's really important for the agency, as you said, to have good information on workload. So data on workload is important because the agency doesn't really ensure that it has the right people in the right places with the right skills and competencies to accomplish the mission of the agency, whether that is to focus on areas that are short-term or long-term. We want to make sure that the agency has that information. It is something that the agency has struggled with for decades. So we continue to make those recommendations. I know the IG has made recommendations in the past. So we think that's really important, again, to ensure that it has the right people in the right places with the right skill sets in the right locations.
Mr. Larsen, could you comment on that, how it affects our ability to respond to these hurricanes? Let me microphone, please.
The IG's work, I think, is directly aligned with the GAO's work in this area. We've issued reports with recommendations. As of July of this year, the agency has responded to and acted on the last of the open recommendations. However, for the last several years, including the current management challenges report that we gave to the agency, we continue to highlight workforce planning as a challenge that the agency needs to address. I guess the simple answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, is that if the agency doesn't know what its work requirements are, it cannot assign and align people to those requirements. And we are urging them to, as Mr. Gómez says, identify the data that allows them to make those comparisons and align their work with their workforce.
And we oftentimes find the weaknesses when it's a time of challenge, which we're facing now. Now, every year since 2015, the GAO has sent a letter to the EPA highlighting high priority recommendations, and GAO considers these recommendations to be critical to EPA's mission of protecting human health and the environment. So, Mr. Gómez, as EPA responds to Hurricane Harvey, as it prepares to respond to Hurricane Irma, are there any high priority recommendations that, if implemented, could have impacted EPA's response to hurricane? I mean, what are the hot priorities right now that need to be done?
So this high priority letter that we've sent to EPA, we've done that since 2015. And what we've done is really looked at the recommendations that GAO has made and identified those areas that we saw as high priority, either areas that GAO has identified as high risk. We have a number of recommendations that are focusing on water infrastructure. So I think one of the priority recommendations that we think does have relevance to Harvey and other future disasters is the area of water infrastructure. So for example, we've done work looking at how small and rural utilities use asset management, which is a really important a really important tool to understand what infrastructure these utilities have, perhaps where the areas are in that infrastructure that are vulnerable or at high risk, so that when a disaster does take place, they're better prepared, both to respond to it, but also if they have to rebuild, they can rebuild with resilience in mind. So we've made a number of recommendations to EPA, getting EPA to work with the Department of Agriculture to come up with better guidelines and information and to encourage the states and the utilities to use asset management. Small utilities are challenged because they don't have the technical expertise necessarily, but we should do whatever we can in the federal family and others to help these communities better prepare for these disasters.
Finally, in June of 2007, GAO released a report on Hurricane Katrina that made several recommendations related to enhancing disaster response. One of these recommendations is still open after 10 years. So, Mr. Gómez, why is that recommendation still open? What was it? And is it going to affect how things are in Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Puerto Rico?
Sure. So what we did in that report from 2007 is we were looking at EPA's response to Katrina and also to the subsequent cleanup. One of the recommendations that we kept open over the years was we had recommended that EPA work with other federal land management agencies, DHS and FEMA, to better coordinate responses to cleanup. And the reason we did that is because we found in the work that national wildlife refuges, which there are several in Louisiana, had been contaminated, and the contamination lasted over a year. And so there was not really good planning to come together and clean up that contamination. Some of the refuges were closed for over a year. So now what's happened since then is Congress passed the Post-Katrina Act, which put in place better national preparedness and also put in place the national response framework, of which EPA has a key role now in responding to hazardous waste and oil spills. So in theory, we expect that EPA is putting in place, for example, in Florida, any response that's needed as the hurricane may come to that region. So we're going to look at that recommendation based on what's happened now and potentially close it because we think it might address what we had been talking about.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Ms. Castor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again, gentlemen. As the agency goes forward to implement what has not been implemented to date, it would seem that the Trump administration's kind of assault on the professional staff there and personnel would have a real impact on the ability to follow through with your recommendations. The Trump administration has still failed to provide nominees for almost all Senate-confirmed leadership positions at EPA. Most regional administrator positions are also without political leadership, including EPA Region 6 in Dallas responding to Hurricane Harvey. The Trump administration, a lot of this, we blame a lot on the Senate, but you can't put too much blame on the Senate here because the Trump administration has not nominated people for Deputy Administrator, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, the Chief Financial Officer, the Assistant Administrator for Environmental Information, International and Tribal Affairs, Land and Emergency Management, Research and Development, and Water. Do you all agree that when you don't have folks in charge that it complicates the ability of the agency to follow through with your recommendations?
Well, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is we have career people who remain in place who do carry out the work of the agency. But as you indicate, the statutory mandates remain in place. And it's up to the agency to figure out a way to carry out those mandates. And it is more difficult if you don't have the leadership.
Yep.
Yes, I would agree that it's important to have all the staff that you need at all levels of the agency to carry out its mission.
And Mr. Gómez, you said that GAO meets with folks at EPA every 6 months. Have you met with Administrator Pruitt? Is it typical that you would meet with the administrator or leadership to go over recommendations from GAO?
So what our Comptroller General likes to do is he likes to meet with all of the new cabinet secretaries and leaders of other offices. So GAO is in the process of scheduling a meeting with Administrator Pruitt, and I would go to that meeting as well with
But that has not been done here in the first 9 months.
We have not scheduled it yet.
You're just like the Energy and Commerce Committee that has yet to see the EPA administrator. Gentlemen, there's a very disturbing press report that came out just a few days ago that the EPA has taken the unusual step of putting a political operative in charge of vetting hundreds of millions of dollars in grants the EPA distributes annually, assigning the funding decisions to a former Trump campaign aide with little environmental policy experience, has already canceled close to $2 million in competitively awarded grants to university and nonprofit organizations. It really does appear like this is being politicized. It says, this is from the Washington Post on September 4th. Earlier this summer, on the same day that Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska joined with 2 other Republicans in voting down a GOP health care bill, EPA staffers were instructed without any explanation to halt all grants to the regional office that covers Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Ohio. That hold was quickly narrowed to just Alaska and remained in place for nearly 2 weeks. The former Bush EPA Administrator, Christine Todd Whitman, said, this is out of the ordinary. We didn't do a political screening on every grant because many of them were based on science, and political appointees don't have that kind of background. Have you all opened any kind of investigation into what's happening here yet?
We've read those reports. We've not received complaints from Congress so far, or from members of the public, or from organizations about this.
Okay.
If you could, or if you would, I offer a general and a specific answer to your question.
Quickly, because I have one more question.
Okay. The general answer is EPA has always been a lightning rod. We get complaints on the one hand that EPA is ignoring its statutory obligations and allowing.
I thank you for that. You have, I believe, opened an investigation last week into Administrator Pruitt's travel, because it is so out of the ordinary that he has, it says, officials in the EPA's Office of Inspector General notified agency leadership last week that Pruitt was in Oklahoma or en route there for nearly half of his first 3 months in office. Maybe that's why GAO can't get a meeting and he can't appear before the Energy and Commerce Committee. But the problem is that it looks like he's been using taxpayer funds for this excessive travel. How long will it take for the OIG to get to the bottom of this investigation?
Ma'am, in our world, we distinguish between investigations and audits, and it's probably a distinction most people don't care about, but we are doing an audit. They tend to take longer. We're going to look not only at the specifics of Mr. Pruitt's travel, but the robustness of the controls that govern travel generally, and whether they're sufficient.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Griffith for 5 minutes.
Let me follow up on that real quick, and correct me if I'm wrong, but an investigation means you're looking into something that might have wrongdoing, and an audit means you're checking into the money to see whether or not we need to put different parameters around it. Would that be a fair assessment, or something along those lines?
Generally, yeah. Investigations tend to look at criminality. They can look at administrative violations. This is not either of those.
This is just an audit to see what we can do better.
Well, it's also going to look at whether there were violations of agency requirements.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Thank you. Let me get down to where I was going to go initially, and that would be that I am concerned about the workforce and the workload questions. EPA's Office of Inspector General, that would be y'all, reported EPA has not conducted workload analysis in over 20 years, making it difficult for EPA to implement corrective actions and allocate its budget effectively. And I guess what I'm looking at there is that, you know, we've heard talk today about a few months where certain positions aren't filled, but here we're looking at 20 years, both Republican and Democrat administrations, that have not, at the EPA, gone in and looked at their workload analysis. And then we see with Hurricane Harvey that we had 13 Superfund sites that were affected. Am I not correct that if we had performed a workload analysis over time, that I'm not saying all 13 of them would have been cleaned up, but that we might have more of these Superfunds being cleaned up? And I also referenced, because we're talking about Harvey so much now, but I remember testimony in a previous hearing in a different subcommittee where they were talking about a site in St. Louis that hadn't been acted on, or in the St. Louis vicinity that had not been acted on in decades as well, that was a Superfund site. So can you help me out? Are those things that would have helped both before a disaster and just in general if we had a workload analysis so we could say these are the worst ones? Let's put most of our people there, and I'm happy to take answers from either of you.
Sure. I'll give my short answer, then Mr. Gómez can respond. My short answer is it's difficult to draw a direct line between the lack of a workforce plan and a specific failure to be able to cover something. I think we can all say, if you knew more precisely where your requirements are and how many people and what kinds of people you need to address those, you would probably have a better result. But I can't draw a direct, one-to-one correlation.
Mr. Gómez.
And I'll just pivot from that last comment, and I think that our point on our work on workforce planning has been exactly that point, is to understand again where, from data, where your people are, what skill sets you need, the locations you need them in, so that you have a better sense of how to meet that mission. And that mission could be that you focus on cleaning up hazardous waste sites. But doing a workforce analysis, I think, would help you hopefully do that better.
Well, and a workforce analysis would help us as legislators as well, although this is not an appropriating committee. We hear all the time that folks need more money. Well, if I know that you need more money because you're going to help rural communities, and I appreciated you mentioning that rural communities with water and waste water, help those communities instead of just send edicts down from the Alabaster Towers in Washington. Here's what you got to do without helping those folks figure out how they're going to do it with the money that they have. That creates big problems. If you had a workload analysis, we might be able to figure out where we could appropriate the money more advantageously to prevent problems before they happen, whether it be after a hurricane or when you've got a serious problem like we had in Flint, Michigan, or issues in my very rural mountainous district where there's problems we don't know how to solve and we're afraid to ask for fear that instead of coming in to help us, they'll just come in and try to punish folks who are trying to do the best they can under limited circumstances in a rural area. So I do appreciate that as well. So thank you, and thank you for putting that in both your oral and your written testimony.
Sir, I have one more comment.
Yes, sir.
That's responsive to your question. That is our OIG Office of Program Evaluations, similar to audits, has a current project underway looking at Superfund workforce planning, and we'll keep you and your staff informed on the progress of that effort.
I greatly appreciate that very much. You know, we're just beginning the Hurricane Harvey efforts, and that will continue for years, and the environmental impacts that are already occurring and yet to be seen. And we talked about the Superfund sites there. Is there anything that you see that is not being done by the EPA currently? I know it's really early in the Hurricane Harvey area that we ought to be concerned about?
Again, I'll give my answer. It's always a dilemma for us. You know, as Chairman Walden said, you don't want to wade into the middle of the cleanup effort. On the other hand, you don't want to wait so long that your efforts are valueless. So we're always trying to figure out when it is that we get into it. I guess what I fall back on is the national response framework that Mr. Gómez alluded to, and it does give certain responsibilities to the EPA. We cannot mandate that EPA take any specific steps. After the fact, I think we would evaluate whether they took the appropriate steps under the framework, but I don't see a role for the OIG jumping in right now in the middle of the cleanup effort.
Thank you, and unfortunately my time is up and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind my colleagues, I heard my colleague from Virginia talk about Superfund or Superfund cleanup in action. I mean, in reality, there is no Superfund. I have had a bill for years to try to get the Superfund, the trust fund, if you will. There's a Superfund program, but there's essentially no Superfund trust fund anymore to pay for anything. And that, you know, back when the Republicans first took to Congress, I know it's ancient history now, with Newt Gingrich as the Speaker, it expired. And I was begged him, and Democrats begged him at the time to renew it, and he refused. I still have the bill out there, and I would ask at any time if our chairman or the Speaker would allow us to reauthorize a Superfund trust fund, because then we would have the money to do these cleanups. And, you know, on an annual basis, I go before the appropriators, because that's the only way to get the money now, through general revenue, unfortunately, and ask for more funding, and we always get less, significantly less than what we asked for. So, you know, it's nice to talk about Superfund cleanup, but the reality is it's been, you know, it was essentially stopped by the Republican Congress. And not to say that, you know, they're totally to blame, but they certainly were the ones that, and you can bring it up any time, and I'll support you passing it in committee or on the floor. I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank the EPA OIG for recently accepting the committee's request to review the propriety of Administrator Pruitt's use of taxpayer funds for travel to and from his home state of Oklahoma. I know that we've already mentioned that, but unfortunately the Trump administration has launched a continuous assault against fundamental science and proposed significant cuts to EPA's budget and staff that threaten to undermine the agency's ongoing efforts to protect human health and the environment. Mr. Gómez, in your testimony, you state that GAO has made 318 recommendations to EPA since fiscal year 2007, including 49 recommendations focused on environmental contamination and cleanup, and these include taking actions for improving cleanup management at hazardous waste sites, enhancing responses to disasters such as Hurricane Katrina. My question is that correct? And how might GAO's recommendations regarding enhancing EPA's response to disasters inform the agency's ongoing response to Hurricane Harvey?
Yes, that is correct. And again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas where we see EPA's recommendations contributing to the response in Harvey and other future disasters is in the area of water infrastructure, where we've recommended that EPA work with states and others to really assist those small communities. We've all heard that in Texas, there were many water systems that were under boiled water notices, and then over 50 systems, I believe, were actually shut down. So we think that it's really important in the area of asset management, which is a really important tool for these utilities to use to understand, again, what they have, what are the areas that are vulnerable, so they can address them and they can use funds to then build them or restore them, and again, building in resilience so that they're better prepared. So I think that's the one area where I would sort of call attention based on our recommendations where there's some immediate benefit.
All right, thank you. You know, I don't want to keep repeating all the budget cuts that the Trump administration has proposed to the EPA, buyouts, you know, all kinds of things that would result in fewer employees. And that could include hundreds of positions in EPA's Region 6 headquarters in Dallas, where employees are currently responding to Hurricane Harvey. So let me ask you about these proposed cuts to your office, to Mr. Larsen. How are current and expected budget limitations impacting staffing levels and the ability of EPA's Office of Inspector General? Specifically, how are they impacting your ability to conduct audits, evaluations, and investigations, if you will?
Thank you for that question. It's a serious challenge to us. We have had to cut our workforce year by year by year, and we are down from 360 or so down to 270, and we anticipate having to go fewer than that based on the most likely budget scenarios. If the original president's budget proposal were to be adopted by Congress, we'd have to cut very substantially the amount of work we did. As you know, we gave you a fairly detailed explanation of where those cuts would occur, which offices, which kinds of projects. What we do is, on an annual basis, plan for the work that we would hope to do based on how much value the project would bring in terms of cost savings or changes in how EPA does business. We will have to do many fewer such projects in any given year based on the likely budget outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Collins, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I'm going to go down a little bit different road, but really talking about Mr. Gómez, if I look back over 10 years, and I'm looking right now just in the environmental area and looking at the suggestions you made for spill preventage, none of which have been implemented. So I guess the question's this, you know, you're doing these audits, making these recommendations. Do you prioritize them in some way, you know, with any kind of ranking system, like, you know, 1 star to 5 stars? And when you see something like this, and now 10 years have gone by, could I assume these would have been considered perhaps lower priority? And then at some point, do you go revisit that with someone, and who is that someone, to say, you know, hey, it's been 10 years, you haven't done any of these things? Or are these just thrown into the hopper and then kind of catch can, they work on these, they don't work on those? I'm trying to just kind of wrap my mind around the day-by-day, year-by-year interaction between your agency and those folks that are supposed to implement it to make sure high-priority things are done and, squeaky wheel that you're, kind of jabbing at them, why didn't you get this done, and so forth. Could you maybe just help us all maybe a little better understand how that all works, the interaction?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say that we take recommendations to EPA very seriously. And so what we do is we have a process in place where we're actively following recommendations that we've made in the last 4 years. What can happen to some of the older recommendations is if we learn from the agency that either they're not going to implement it, or that we make an assessment that things have changed, or it's no longer a priority, we'll go ahead and close it as not implemented. Now, there are recommendations, though, that are older than 4 years, that we're still keeping track of because we have an indication that EPA is still working, and we hope that they actually do take action. We can go back at any time and open up any old recommendation that was not implemented if we think it's important or if others have brought it to our attention. Our recommendations and the status of the recommendations are public. So you can go to any of our reports, you can click on the recommendation status, you can see what the rec was and what the status was. So we do have this separate letter that we mentioned earlier, which is a priority rec letter that our Comptroller General sends to all of the cabinet agencies and other offices, calling attention to recommendations that we see as a high priority. And for EPA, we've identified those recommendations that deal with the high-risk area of managing toxic chemicals, and then some of the recommendations that deal with water infrastructure and also pollution of our waters. So that letter can also change year from year if we go through the history and identify other recs that we think are important. So we do that process as well. Now, I also mentioned that we work with EPA sort of on an ongoing basis as we're doing audits, but formally we go to them twice a year with a long list of all our recommendations to say, here they are, they're still open, let us what's happening, let us know which we can close. So we do that twice a year formally, but we're in contact with them throughout the year.
So, that's very helpful because I think sometimes we may not understand how that all works and think you just throw it in and go on about your business. And I think it's actually reassuring to me, certainly for one, that you've got, it sounds like pretty good interaction. Would you say that?
Yes.
You're making them aware, they're listening, it's back and forth, and as you...
Right, I mean, there are some recommendations where the agency would disagree with us, and so we may be at a point where they disagree, we still think it's a good recommendation, and so there's some like that, and those might be closed as not implemented. But EPA is taking our recommendations seriously, and they want to close them out. They want to do what we're saying. It's just in some cases, some of our recommendations might take a little longer to do. For example, if we're recommending that an IT system, for example, be revised or a new IT system be put in place, that may take a while longer than if we just recommend that the agency use existing web tools, for example, to provide better information to the public. We don't see that as taking a long time, or it shouldn't take a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that overview. That was very helpful for me. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Now recognize Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member, Ms. Castor, and I thank our witnesses for joining us today. Like Mr. Pallone, my district in New York sustained very substantial damage as a result of Superstorm Sandy, so I'm very sensitive to the conditions on the ground in Houston, as well as concerned about the rest of hurricane season, quite frankly. And so standing up a robust operation with the EPA, I know is critical at this time. There have been a number of reports about unfolding environmental concerns stemming from Harvey right now. And so, Mr. Larsen, I recognize that your role at EPA may not directly involve you in emergency response efforts. However, to the extent that you're able, could you please inform us of the EPA's role in responding to unfolding environmental threats?
Sure. As Mr. Gómez alluded to earlier, I think the primary set of responsibilities that EPA has here stem from the National Response Framework, which came after some of the earlier natural disasters. And that means that EPA has responsibility as a support agency for certain functions, and it's got a primary responsibility for certain functions. And the areas where we would expect to see EPA involved are assessing and addressing fuel shortages, monitoring public water systems, securing Superfund sites, and assessing conditions at major industrial facilities.
Very well. And Mr. Gómez, how will GAO evaluate the EPA's efforts to respond to the environmental threats posed by hurricane season, Hurricane Harvey being the most recent example?
Sure. So GAO in the past, we looked at the Katrina recovery efforts, so that was something that we did. We're happy to assist Congress in any reviews or oversight that you'd like us to do as a result of Hurricane Harvey.
Mr. Larsen, addressing the numerous cleanup issues related to Harvey's flooding will likely be very costly to both local and the federal government. What roles do you envision your office will be playing to ensure that federal money the EPA uses to contract for Harvey cleanup will be safeguarded from fraud and abuse?
Yes, thank you. We're going to do two things. One is EPA OIG specific work. The other thing I want to mention is that the organization of IGs across the federal government, the SIGI, has learned from the past, and in the past has had a disaster assistance working group, which is basically the IGs from the various agencies that are going to have to play a role here. And so EPA will be participating in that effort, this agency-wide IG or government-wide OIG effort to make sure that everybody's doing what they need to do and not duplicating each other. For ourselves, we'll probably, as you allude to, be looking at contracting issues, whether there was fraud involved. That could take the form of audits or investigations, as we distinguished earlier. That is what's their criminal activity going on, or was there sloppy practice with regard to contracting. So those are the areas that we would see fairly early on getting involved in.
Very well. And Mr. Gómez, given that post-Harvey cleanup will be lengthy and costly, and I'm assuming if we're hit with Irma and any other hurricanes coming down the pike, what areas do you anticipate your GAO team will be interested in examining?
Well, again, we're here to assist Congress, so whatever Congress asks us to do, as we've seen from at least what's becoming clear in Texas with the Superfund sites and all the water infrastructure systems that are down, that maybe those are areas where potentially we could look at. But again, we can have discussions with anyone in Congress who's interested in having GAO look at the response efforts.
Very well. I cannot emphasize enough that we need to address any environmental threats posed to the residents of the Harvey-affected region and perhaps even Florida coming down the pipe. My thoughts are with the people of Houston, the responders assisting on the scene, and let's be sure to get these folks what they need to help them get back on their feet. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Costello, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony here today. Mr. Gómez, I'd like to start with you. Your written testimony mentions that in 2015, the EPA awarded approximately $3.9 billion, or nearly half of its budget, in grants to state and local governments for important projects such as repairing aging water infrastructure, preventing pollution, improving air quality, and cleaning up hazardous waste sites. However, GAO found weaknesses in EPA's ability to manage these grants efficiently and effectively. My question is, would you please elaborate on the weaknesses GAO identified in EPA's grant management procedures, Second, how have these grant management inefficiencies and weaknesses impacted grant recipients? I think that's a very important question. And then finally, have these inefficiencies contributed to the wasting of grant money or made it more difficult for recipients to use grant funding for its intended purposes?
Sure, thank you for those questions. So we've done a body of work on grants management, and that particular report, what we looked at also, we're looking to see for recipients, for example, where they were doing duplicative reporting. So currently under the grants management at EPA, grant recipients have to provide performance reports, and then they also have to provide more information and data when EPA asks for it. So we identified a number of places where there was duplicative reporting by the recipients. And so we've recommended that EPA identify all of those places and try to do away with the duplication so that recipients aren't having to spend additional time and resources in doing the reporting. So that's one area where we called attention to it. And so, and really for EPA also to streamline, and EPA does have a streamline initiative in place in its grants management, but we were calling attention to those places where they can do away with duplication so that the recipients can carry on with the grants and not have to do a lot of reporting.
Mr. Larsen. The OIG made similar findings with respect to areas for improvement in EPA's management of grants. Do you have anything to add to the line of questioning that I posed to Mr. Gómez relative to the management of grants?
I wish I did. As Representative Clark noted, I'm an expert in some areas, not so much in others.
I often say that myself.
So, but what I would be happy to do is organize and get back to you and your staff with the primary findings that we've had in those areas.
Thank you. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Ruiz of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witness for taking the time joining us this morning. We've heard about the EPA's role in the emergency response programs for natural disasters like Hurricane Harvey and your coordinate efforts with FEMA, state, local. I'm interested in your efforts to coordinate with tribes and what have you done to reach out and engage tribes with your efforts in Hurricane Harvey?
So far, we've not reached out to anybody. As I said, at this point, we don't want to wander onto the battlefield while the battle's underway. The SIGI, that is the IG community-wide effort that I alluded to earlier, is, among other things, going to coordinate among the various IGs and also with the tribes and the states.
Well, I think that's important to take back to this group, not to neglect the sovereignty of tribes and the role that tribes have in order to maintain their environment during natural disasters as well. And so reaching out to them and coordinating. Some tribes actually have equipment and the technology that can help the disaster response, like we've seen in my district with the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians utilizing helicopters and other surveillance technology in coordination with the fire departments to put out some wildfires. So I would highly recommend that you take it back and you start coordinating also with tribes as a sovereign nation and a governmental entity themselves. They can be very, very helpful for the region. What are, given the OIG's review of the EPA's response to environmental threats, what are some of the lessons learned from some of the that we might see for future storm threats in an area where the IG might consider additional audit work?
Sure. We've unfortunately had Katrina, we've had Superstorm Sandy, we've learned from both. Among the things that we learned were that the coordination between EPA and the Corps of Engineers wasn't necessarily what it could have been or should have been. Coordination with state and local officials probably could have been done better. We've addressed those to the agency. Presumably this time around, you'll see better coordination. Most likely, we'll be coming in and seeing whether, in fact, that occurred.
Are you prepared to assess that?
Yes.
And the difference on whether or not those recommendations were followed?
I can't commit that we're going to. I expect we will. To Mr. Pallone's question earlier, we're resources constrained, but that would be a high priority for us.
So if you were to pick, and this is a question for both of you, if you were to pick a #1 barrier for you to do your jobs, is EPA involved either in coordination or protecting Superfund sites or protecting water infrastructure, et cetera, so that they're not contaminated, what would that barrier be? If you were to pick the biggest barrier, what would it be, Mr. Larsen?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound dense, but are you talking about EPA's response or the OIG's evaluation of the EPA's response?
Well, the EPA's response.
Okay.
You evaluate the EPA. So what would you say would be the EPA's barrier in doing its job in these?
Boy, you're putting me in the position of speaking for them, but I would think it's resources, people and money.
People and money. Mr. Gómez?
So I would say, in the areas that we're seeing unfolding, right, which is in water infrastructure and in the Superfund sites, at least in Texas, that are flooded, is making sure that they have enough people there on the ground to respond to those two immediate areas where potentially there are risks involved. So I would say that would be, if that is a barrier, that they should have enough folks there to address it right now.
And so what can Congress do to address that barrier? Mr. Larsen?
Well, in my view, you've already got the substantive requirements in place. You've got the Clean Air Act, you've got the Clean Water Act, and it's up to EPA to execute on that. They need the people, and they need the policy determination to carry forward.
I think it's what you're doing now, is the oversight, right, of looking to see how that's being done, and even after the fact, how was it done, and could something be done better?
So the oversight is the diagnostic workup, right? And you're telling us that the diagnosis is lack of funding and lack of people. So the treatment is the next step. So you can't just diagnose a problem and walk away. You have to act on it and give the treatment to the patient. And so the treatment is the funding and policies that will help bring more people on site to manage the situation, not only in the short acute disaster, but in the long-term public health recuperation. I have disaster training in my background. I did a fellowship at Harvard in the humanitarian disaster response, so that's where I'm speaking from. Thank you very much. I yield back.
I think I now recognize Ms. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today and for your work to improve the EPA. We've been very focused on the people, and agencies aren't just agencies, they are people. And as my colleagues have noted, it is about the people, but I'm concerned that this agency for a long period of time has not accepted your recommendations when it comes to people and when it comes to their workforce. In 2010, GAO issued a report recommending the EPA establish mechanisms to evaluate workforce planning, which are people, placement of people. But the recommendations currently closed and unimplemented. So, Mr. Gómez, why was this recommendation closed before EPA was able to implement it, if you know?
So again, we track recommendations for 4 years, and if we have an indication that the agency is not going to do it, we close it as not implemented. Obviously, we've done some recent work that's focused on grants management, but also looking at workforce issues in particular, which is a large part of EPA. So EPA has told us that currently they are giving workforce planning a priority. So we are going to look to see how much of a priority that is, and in fact, what they're going to do. We've been talking about that it's basically about data. They don't have good workforce data. They don't have good information on the types of work that each of their staff is doing across offices and across regions. So if you don't have that data, then you, again, don't ensure that you have the right people in the right places with the right skill sets to accomplish the mission that's needed.
Which is, those are the management challenges that you are dealing with them and have dealt with them for years. It sounds like this is not new. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you have any sense what percentage of EPA's funding goes to private sector contract work versus the public sector work?
So in our 2010 report, we did look at contractors, and at the time, there were 6,000 contractors at EPA. And so I'm not sure exactly what that translates to in terms of budget, but I think it's a considerable chunk of their budget. And so what we also found in that report was that contractors were not part of EPA's planning either, were not incorporated. So, and we learned from EPA recently that they're still not incorporated in their planning. And we think that that should be something that they should do.
When they employ 6,000 contractors, they're not taken into consideration in their strategic plans?
Correct.
And have they agreed recently to take all of those thousands of contractors into account in their plans?
So far, what we've learned is that they haven't done it yet still. So I'm not sure if they're agreeing or disagreeing. The explanation they gave us was that OMB didn't require them in their planning to include contractors. And so that's why they didn't do it.
Is it fair to say, and I'm going to ask you, Mr. Larsen, I've always been very concerned about information security issues, and for the IG, that's what you focus on as well. And there are a number of contractors, as I understand, and if some bad actors or wrongdoers want to wreak a bit of havoc in systems, they could certainly do it through information technology. Can you talk with us about the lack of understanding at EPA relative to sensitive data, the access to sensitive data, and what you have found about the information or lack of information about the knowledge of EPA and those access to sensitive data?
Sure. I think what we talk about is risk as opposed to actual problems that have manifested. That is, we've not investigated an insider threat where an individual breached his obligations and created a vulnerability. What we're talking about is if we don't address the vulnerabilities, then the potential is out there. So that's what we've been looking at, and we find that the agency doesn't know how serious a problem that is, and they haven't taken the steps to mitigate the potential risk that we've identified.
And that was just in your July of 17 report that the agency just issued?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to express my deepest condolences to our fellow Americans who are suffering from the devastation of Hurricane Harvey. Everyone has witnessed this day-by-day reporting with just deep concern and sadness for the folks who are enduring. EPA has, therefore, an important role to play in disaster response and recovery, ensuring the environmental monitoring and remediation needed to protect public health. And these storms, these natural disasters, don't know for Republican or Democrat, so it ought to be a universally agreed to approach that we take here in Washington. But that can only be done if EPA has the resources and personnel to do so. This weekend, the EPA released statements highlighting just some of the work they will need to do in the days, weeks, and months ahead. That includes assessing 13 existing Superfund sites that were flooded and could be damaged, addressing the many drinking and wastewater systems that remain shut down or damaged or are dealing with health advisories, assisting with testing for private wells, and supporting local first responders with monitoring and cleanup following chemical fires at the Arkema facility in Crosby, Texas. The need for a strong, robust EPA is outstandingly clear, and massive budget and workforce cuts and proposals to weaken, understaff, or even eliminate regional offices are not the answer. Beyond that, I have to believe it is tremendously demoralizing to the professional staff of the agency, many of whom offer their lifetime career to the agency and to the betterment of Americans across the country. So I want to thank you, Mr. Gómez and Mr. Larsen, for being here this morning. The recommendations proposed by GAO and the IG's office can continue to make EPA a more efficient and successful agency. Sadly, this administration, the Trump administration, is aggressively working to dismantle the EPA through regulatory rollbacks, extreme budget cuts, and staff eliminations, and ongoing assault on science. These are foolish cuts, proven to be very foolish when we see disasters displayed right before our very eyes. Mr. Gómez, GAO released a report on EPA, Interior and Forest Service workforce planning in March of 2010, which concluded that the agency's efforts have, I quote, particularly fallen short in aligning the agency's workforce plans with their strategic plans. The report concludes that agencies are at risk of not having the appropriately skilled workforce they need to effectively achieve their missions. So are you generally familiar with that report of 2010?
Yes.
Mr. Gómez, did EPA take action to address that?
They have not yet.
What about further actions in regard, will they be doing anything that you know of in respect to workforce planning to correct those, the numbers that they require?
No, that's still an outstanding recommendation, again, to properly align its workforce plan with its strategic plan and its budget.
And the Trump administration proposed cutting funding to the agency by nearly $2.6 billion. That's about a 31% reduction. And proposed reducing the workforce by some 3,800 employees. Nearly 50 programs to protect our air and water, address climate change, and strengthen chemical safety were highlighted for elimination. Just unbelievable cuts. This included the Chemical Safety Board, the independent federal agency tasked with investigating chemical accidents, such as the recent fires at the Arkema chemical plant in Crosby, Texas. Mr. Gómez, in your testimony today, you note that the March 2010 report found that, I quote, the ability of federal agencies to achieve their mission and carry out their responsibilities depends in large part on whether they can sustain a workforce that possesses the necessary education, knowledge, skills, and other competencies. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chair. We should all be concerned about how extreme the budget cuts proposed are, and that the staffing reductions proposed would undermine EPA's ability to accomplish its mission, especially in the face of disasters. These are troubling cuts and proven day by day now with these disasters to be the most foolish approach to an agency that was envisioned by President Nixon to address safe water that we drink, clean air that we breathe, and all the environmental benefits that should be associated with our rights as Americans to enjoy that environment as fully as possible. So I do appreciate the work you're doing to draw the attention of the American public to these cuts and to the essential elements that these agencies require in order to respond fully and effectively to their mission. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And seeing we have no more members here, we will conclude this hearing. I'd like to thank all the witnesses and members that participated in today's hearing. I realize a lot of this was along the lines of what else we're going to be doing. We felt it very important to get it on the record for EPA to hear. We expect them to take care of these issues, to fill those positions are needed, to take some accounting of what's going on, because we will be asking more and tougher questions about what has happened in terms of preparedness and response here. None of us want to see any loss of life or property caused by some problems with an agency fulfilling their duties as you have outlined them for us. So we thank you for your observations and your comments today. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions to the record. I ask that the witnesses all agree to respond promptly to the questions. With that, this committee is adjourned.